Hi, this is Ken Adams with the Valley View, and I'm joined this time by State Representative Paul Evans. So welcome to the show, Paul.
Thanks for inviting me.
And we just got over a short session in the Oregon legislature.
Yes, we did.
And there's quite a bit of talk about what happened during the legislative session. One of the things being that all the bills were read in their entirety, which caused a little bit of consternation because it slowed things down considerably.
It was certainly not boring, I'll tell you that.
Well, maybe reading those and listening to those bills in full length could have been a little boring.
It had its moments that way. Fortunately, in the House, about halfway through, the Republican leader allowed many of the bills to be read by title only. Not all, and in each case there had to be a statement read. But the Senate, I think, actually stayed the entire time. The House actually gave suspension a few times, and we were able to get some business done.
So that kind of created an atmosphere of some problems, but you were able to get 3 of your own bills passed.
We were very fortunate, yeah.
And that came through cooperation from both parties.
It did.
And so I know that you had the 3 bills. Which ones are they, and what were they about?
Well, the most important bill, and the bill that I think was the most bipartisan, was House Joint Resolution 202. And House Joint Resolution 202 is a referral to the ballot. Basically, the legislature has the power to send an idea to the citizens of Oregon for their concurrence. And this referral would set aside 1.5% of the Oregon Lottery revenues for veteran services and outreach. And my co-chief was Representative Julie Parrish, a Republican. Myself, we had every member of the House Veterans Committee sign on. And after the fact, we had an equal number of Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats sign on in the Senate. And in fact, in the Senate, we had a Republican senator that led the day, and Brian Boquist. And it was a complete bipartisan, bicameral approach. And House Joint Resolution 202 did get through both chambers. It is going to the voters, and ultimately it will hopefully provide about $18 million on a biennial basis to help get more veterans into the services that they've earned. We were also able to get another bill with Senator Boquist, a Republican senator, 1565, which allows for rural industrial development to basically help our wineries and our distillery industry develop. It's a temporary tax exemption that allows folks to put all their focus on building the business and then being able to pay the taxes at a higher level once they're built. And then we had House Bill 4081, which had a Republican co-chief, Representative John Davis out of Wilsonville, that was a housing security bill. And we were very, very fortunate to have success with those 3 bills. And I think all of them were a testament to working across the aisle and recognizing that the best policy usually results from people of different perspectives working together in common cause.
Now, you said housing security. What do you mean by that?
Great question. Right now, in the state of Oregon, in every city, there is a great concern about housing affordability and housing availability. Some places the expenses are higher than others. Some places the availability has different faces on it. What we try to do with 4081 is that there is a tax exemption for nonprofits that provide reduced rent for housing affordability. And this tax exemption was set to sunset in 2018. We moved the sunset to 2022, and the reason we did that was we figure after the 2020 census, we'll know more about who needs what the economic situation is, who's actually living where, and we'll have better information to try to find a long-term solution. But the reason we felt that was important is had we not moved that particular sunset, it was very likely that 250 to 300 people might not have a place to live, which would only exacerbate the existing problem of housing affordability and availability.
Well, I know here in Salem there's a deficit of about 6,400 units.
Yes.
Of affordable housing, and that quite often vouchers that are given out by the county and so on are turned back in because people simply can't find
Yes.
affordable housing.
That's right.
And so this would help address that problem,
It
or at
helps
least make
secure
sure
it.
it doesn't get any worse.
Right, exactly. The first thing when you're in a hole, stop digging, and that's what we tried to do with that particular bill. We also, again, very public. There was a 4-bill package that the legislature voted on. I actually voted in support of 2 of those measures that was designed to help provide business development with some tools to be able to pencil out the kinds of development we want, and at the same time provide clear guidelines for what the expectations are for public subsidy and public support. I think as a package, it moved Oregon in the right direction. There were some particular issues with 2 of those bills that I couldn't quite get there for, but a couple of the major issues having to do with inclusionary zoning for high-density affordable housing. I think that anytime you have the home builders and the affordable housing community working together, you know that something is probably a good solution. And we also were able to work on rent security to make sure that folks that are on a month-to-month basis aren't unfairly taken advantage of. So they have a 1-year basically protection from rent increases if they're on a month-to-month contract, which we felt was a fair thing to do.
And if I'm not mistaken, in that bill, they would have to be given 90 days notice
For
a
rent
increase.
Right, 90-day notice for rent increase. It bumped it from 60 to 90, and we also provided from 30 to 60 for eviction, so that if they were going to be no notice eviction, no fault eviction, they get a little extra time to plan to go find another place to live.
Well, yes, because sometimes it's not that easy
It's
to
not
find
that
another
easy.
place.
That's right. It's not.
So there were some other bills, though, in the legislature that you were interested in, and there's also the minimum wage was
Yes.
one that was talked about in great detail.
Yes.
And there was a ballot measure in the works to increase it to $15, but there was a kind of a compromise made
Yeah.
in the legislature that looks like it's going to prevent that ballot measure from coming forward.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that. The minimum wage in Oregon, it was not a pretty process, and I don't want to color it in a way that isn't fair. It was not a pretty process. I think that we could have come out with a slightly more effective tool. Having said that, all things considered, I'd give us about a B on a scale of A to F on what we were able to accomplish. And here's what I mean by that. Going into the legislative session, the pressure from 2 different ballot measure groups created an environment where the information that the business community and that the organized community had all pointed to the fact that there was enough support in the electorate in numbers that would sustain even a negative effort, that $13.50 for a statewide minimum wage would have passed. There's no question in my mind it would have. The issue, though, is it would have passed and it would have had a 3-year burn-in, which means that's not a lot of time for business to plan to that, and it would set a statewide wage. So from the 2015 to this recent session, my team has been working with small businesses throughout the area. And it wasn't a question of whether or not minimum wage was going to go up. I felt that it probably would. But what is the right way? What's the right time? What are the factors that needed to be considered? And how can we make sure that it's the first step of a longer process? And here's what I mean by that. First is minimum wage needed to be approached because we have not had a lot of equity and fairness in terms of sharing the increases in productivity and wealth over the last 20 years. The middle class is working harder and they're not able to keep up. So we needed an increase in the minimum wage. But more importantly, once that's in place, we also have to figure out a way to help protect small and local businesses succeed in a very complex global environment. That's what we're going to be working on in 2017. However, in the meantime, on the minimum wage, we recognize that there's really at least 2 or 3 different Oregons. There's Portland, which is itself.
Right.
There's the rural and the frontier areas, and then there's everywhere else. And there were a couple of different plans to do it. The governor actually had a plan that said cities would be recognized as a second tier, and then it became counties, and they basically went from the poverty information, which the United States government provides, to the self-sufficiency index. If people ask why which county was in what tier, it was the self-sufficiency index. That was actually the deciding factor. So we recognized that Oregon couldn't really have one rate and make it universe because Portland is different. We also recognize that the economic realities of Harney County, for example, are not the same as even Marion County. So we worked for three tiers, and we also recognized that a 6-year burn-in, legislatively directed, was probably the most appropriate way to make sure that we still have the ability to tweak things if necessary in terms of timing. If the economy really goes really bad or really good, we can adjust. If it was allowed to be at the ballot, what you get with the ballot, you're generally kind of stuck with. And we didn't have a lot of flexibility. So I'm excited that we were able to pass a minimum wage that I think it will raise people's wages 50 cents this year. I mean, everybody talks about how it's going to raise everything so fast. It's 50 cents this year. And then over a 6-year horizon, the different tiers will come online. And by 2022, 2023, we'll have a pretty good idea of how it's affecting, how it's burning in, and what changes we need to make. There's already some discussion about particular targeted rebates, particular targeted tax credits for certain industries that maybe have more influence from global pricing than others. The point to me is this: whatever adjustments we make, we have to make sure we protect our local and small businesses. We have to make sure that the minimum wage people are receiving is the minimum wage. I believe we can actually use workforce development funds to help soften that impact. But as long as the paycheck that the worker gets is the same, they're getting the minimum wage that they would normally get in their particular part of the state, I think we all win. And that's a really long answer, but I'm very happy with what we came out with.
Now, somebody was asking me actually the other day if this was going to apply to farm workers.
Yes.
And it will apply to farm workers.
That's why we did it by region.
Okay.
In predominantly rural counties, they will be up to $12.50 again by 2022. It was very important for the folks that are involved in the agricultural community, especially the workers, that there wasn't a separate class or a forgotten class. So that's why instead of having particular targeted wages, we have 3 tiered wages. The rural frontier counties are the lowest. Portland is the highest. The rest of the state's in the middle, and there's actually statutory language that makes Portland always the highest and the rural and the frontier counties always the lowest. Our next step, because we do believe that the global pricing of agricultural products is a real factor, and we do know farmers are stretched because the pears in Venezuela may be setting the price for the globe. We're going to be working on rebates and tax credits for those companies that, again, have more influence from global pricing. So instead of limiting what the wages are for the workers, we're going to try to work with the employers to help set up some kind of shared responsibility model that I think is the best long-term solution.
And one of the problems that I've seen too with like wages, and actually I'm kind of glad you brought up farming, in a sense that a lot of times the farmer is now limited as to who he can sell to.
Yep.
I mean, because of consolidation of a lot of these companies, it seems like the Sherman Antitrust Act has been long forgotten. It hasn't been enforced since basically the 70s. And so you've had this consolidation of companies so that someone can't choose between very many folks about who he can sell his produce to, or animal products to.
Right.
And that's a big problem, but that's not something that can be easily handled at the state level.
It's not something that can be easily handled, but it's important to recognize, and here's the issue. Many farmers that came in and were very, very concerned about the minimum wage, and again, my grandpa was a dairyman. I get their concern. When you were growing crops or raising animals, you literally are bound to the price the market presents. So they had real concerns. Our solution, or at least my solution, is to recognize that there's a difference between the agribusiness and the farmer. We have a lot of farmers, both in the seed and in the commodity, even in milk, that their prices are set by the folks who buy them, just like you said. I want to help those local and regional farmers in terms of making sure that we help stabilize their costs so they can still make enough profit to have the jobs, they can still make enough profit to be in the business. I'm not as concerned, quite frankly, of the profits of the Archer Daniels Midlands of the world that seem to be doing fine, thank you very much. And unfortunately, sometimes these debates, these discussions get forced into all the folks involved in agriculture on one side and all the folks in labor on the other. And I actually refuse that division. I believe that workers and small businesses have far more in common with each other than we do with the big corporations that actually have no real investment in the state of Oregon, and if they can save a penny, they'll move everything to Minnesota. I think that Oregon has a much better chance bringing people together, and that's why we've started, since 2015, a small business agenda. I'm very clear that the minimum wage was the first step. The second step is we've got 7 or 8 bills we need to move forward on to make sure and protect local and small businesses, because we are in this together. Now, the Walmarts of the world, the ADMs of the world, the big large seed companies of the world, they're here and they're part of things, but they're not family. You take care of family.
One of the things that I guess has always bothered me is that if you're making the minimum wage, you shouldn't be living in poverty.
That's right.
And I don't care if you're a single person. And, like a lot of times you'll hear talk about, well, they're inexperienced, they're young, and so on. But I know a number of kids that have gone through the foster system, and they get turned out at 18, so they have no family support system. And they're certainly entitled to a wage that pays for a good place to live and whatever else they need to survive. Right. And I think that's a lot of times forgotten.
Right. Well, it is forgotten. It's also forgotten, or at least perhaps not always paid attention to, that most minimum wage workers in today's reality aren't teenagers. And many of them are, in fact, single mothers trying to make sure and pay for the things that it takes to get through life. We have a fundamental problem, and we're dealing with the consequences. The fundamental problem is this. The United States, over the last 30 to 40 years, has tried to maintain a middle class on an economy and within a set of principles that no longer exist. When capital became so mobile that you could move trillions of dollars with the click of a mouse, all the theories related to free market went out the window. David Ricardo was very clear back when he and Adam Smith were writing the rules on this stuff. So what we have to figure out how we're going to do is, number one, figure out how we can stabilize the workforce. Number two, how we can train, prepare, and make our workers for the future the most flexible ever. And number three, we've got to figure out how to use public subsidy, private partnerships, public opportunities, and timing and everything else to help create an environment where we have innovation and we have new startups and we have companies that can compete in the global market as it's going to be. And throughout all of that, we have to figure out how we're going to build a new middle class for the 21st century. We have to get people out of poverty, but we have to get people out of poverty based on work rather than continued basic subsistence. And that's why I understand the minimum wage is a very frustrating issue for some folks, but I would rather be paying some subsidy to help somebody have a job and learn how to work than not. And I think it's time we get back in the business of rewarding work more than rewarding wealth. The time for folks to be able to live off dividends, the time for folks to be able to benefit from sending jobs overseas has got to stop. And we may not be able to change the federal government. We can sure do something in Oregon. And I believe the conversation we started with the minimum wage, again, was the first step. This next step is going to be the most exciting because we get to figure out how we can help support our local and expanding businesses, how we can turn people's ideas into new economies, how we can actually promote entrepreneurship, how we can promote innovation. That is how we're going to actually be able to build what I hope is a sustainable middle class. But we've got a lot of work to do.
But that's an important goal. And part of that goal is working with both parties.
That's right.
And we don't see that so much at the national level.
Not much, no.
But we do see it, I think, here in Oregon. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that relationship that you have, because as I was mentioning earlier, you've worked with Republicans to get various bills passed.
Well, I'm very blessed. I really am. I'm in a swing seat by all the rules of the road. There shouldn't be a Republican that wants to work with me because they want to win back the seat. However, I was a city councilor, I was a mayor, I was a school board member, and I worked for Governor Kulongoski for 3 years. I mentioned the Kulongoski piece because I built relationships with people across the aisle, Republican and Democrat. So when I came into the legislature in January of 2015, a lot of the folks that I had worked with when I was on the governor's team, they're still around. And those that aren't, but are more moderate, more willing to work with Democrats, heard the reputation that I will work with anybody because I recognize that we are always better when we have everybody's ideas on the table. We're always smarter. We're always a better team. So whether it was working with Boquist in the Senate or working with Julie Parrish in the House or working with Representative John Huffman on a number of issues related to the budget, or Representative Vic Gilliam on a number of issues in the past and certainly in this session, I am instinctively the kind of guy who likes to work across the aisle, across even within your party, the ideological divide, to try to learn, to try to figure out what's the best option. Roger Bassett, a guy who I learned how to make public policy from, he used to teach me that the best way to do it is think of it as a Christmas tree. You go to the store, you go to the lot, whatever it is, you pick up the Christmas tree, you bring it home, and then you let everybody put on the lights and all the garlands and everything else, and it becomes everybody's tree. As long as you're not wedded to getting the credit, which I really don't care about the credit, I just want to get the problem solved.
You want to get the tree up and looking
I want
nice.
to get the tree up and looking good. So I think that we were able to do a lot more than people thought we could this session. I think even though it was an ugly process, we came out with what I believe, again, is a B to B plus minimum wage. I think over time we're going to make it an A. I think the coal to clean bill was not pretty, but it was a consensus bill from the two interests that were the most involved in it. I think it's an important bill, at least as a starting point. Both of those could have gone to the ballot, but the legislature played a role in making sure it didn't. And if nothing gives you hope about bipartisanship, if nothing gives you hope, I ask you to look at what happened with Vic Gilliam and his bill for statues. Representative Vic Gilliam used to work for Senator Mark Hatfield. Representative Gilliam believes Mark Hatfield represents the very best ideals of our state, and I happen to believe he's probably right about that. And his bill to put Chief Joseph and Mark Hatfield in the U.S. Capitol Statutory Hall, a lot of people didn't necessarily think that that was the most important thing we could do, but we recognized it was important to him. And it was important for Oregon to have good symbols. And 60 House members, all of us, Republican, Democrat, Portland folks, folks from Harney County, all of us went to the Senate President's office as one body saying this is an important thing for us. That, to me, is how the real legislature works. You work together in common cause. You identify things that are important, and you recognize you can have the political fights that you have to have, but at the end of the day, there is this thing called an Oregon story, and we have to add to it. Unfortunately, those stories don't get the press. What gets the press is having to read the bills line by line or some of the other stuff that gets people more upset.
Well, that is, I think, one of the problems that we're having in this country today, not just here in Oregon, is the press seems to be driving stories instead of reporting them.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is causing us a lot of problems because they kind of thrive on discord and, one party against the other or things of that nature, rather than what are people actually doing about the problems? What are the problems? What are the underlying causes of those problems? And what is being done to try to alleviate those problems?
Right.
And that's real reporting. And we seem to be getting away from that into more of an entertainment mode.
Yeah.
And I see that at many different levels. And it is, quite frankly, it's disturbing for someone of my age to look at the media and see what passes for news today. And
well, it's not only in the media. I mean, if you think about it, one candidate running for president, he's a reality TV star. I mean,
who has gotten in this campaign over $1 billion worth of TV
right.
time at no cost.
And reality TV stars have a place. I'm not sure it's in government. I mean, I don't know.
Well, I don't know if they even have it in entertainment, frankly.
Well, I don't know what, I think it's real easy on TV to be able to say this, that, or the other thing, as long as there's a cut. We'll redo this, or here's what you read, or here's what you do. That isn't how you make decisions in real life. And in real life, when you make a decision, there's consequences. And again, I spent 20 years in the military learning how to make decisions, sometimes the hard way. But I believe this country deserves leaders that have been tested. I believe this country deserves leaders that aren't afraid to work across the aisle. I believe that this country deserves leaders that have local government experience and a respect for the process. And what that means is you may not get your idea this time, but you don't blow the whole thing up just because you didn't get your way. You don't throw a temper tantrum because you're not happy with the process. You instead make the best case you can, and then you invest time and effort to try to convince the other side to think about it again and change it in the process. You don't blow things up just for the fun of it.
Well, that brings up Harney County then.
It does. Yes, it does.
And you know, there was this, the original supposed cause of this was 2 farmers being given heavier prison sentences after they had already served some time.
After not paying their taxes for 20-some years, yeah.
Well, yeah, but it was also the fact that they set fire to some public property,
Yes.
which, you know, is a serious crime and endangered people's lives. But the mandatory minimums that people have been pushing for a long time aren't necessarily good policy, because it doesn't allow a judge to make a decision about the degree we're talking about.
Right.
And so that was a problem. But, you know, I got to think that George Washington and Madison and some of the rest that looked at the Shays Rebellion, which led to the Constitutional Convention, would have a very different view of armed insurrection, which is what I saw this as.
Yeah, you know, there's 2 issues I think that are important for this particular conversation. The first is, when it comes to mandatory minimums, or it comes to matrix-driven decisions from judges, I absolutely agree with you. I have this old-fashioned belief that you appoint or elect a judge, and then here we go, you let them be a judge. I don't understand when the legislature decides to, or sometimes people for their own purposes push a ballot measure to convince people that judges should be limited in what they need to do. I think you give judges discretion, you hold them accountable, and that's how it's supposed to work. That said, what happened in Harney County was, in fact, insurrection. If you are in a place and you are claiming that the laws of that land no longer apply, and you are setting up your own legal system, which this particular group brought in some judge, or at least somebody who called himself a judge, to do this, it is in fact insurrection. And I'm frustrated because, again, we can look at the specific events and say these types of things shouldn't happen. What's at work, I think, is that right now so many people in the left and the right are so frustrated because what used to work doesn't anymore. They've lost faith in the mechanisms of government. Now, they don't have to love government, but they used to at least have faith in government. That's where it's on us as leaders. We've got to rethink how we can earn the trust of the electorate. We've got to start getting back in the business of telling people the truth instead of during campaigns telling them half-truths and what they want to hear, and be honest with them about how we're going to get out of the situation we're in right now and how we're going to make things better. I look at Harney County as a lesson. If we're not careful, if we continue to allow people to focus on division, we're going to see more of them, and that's a tragedy.
Well, it is, Paul. And you know what else is a tragedy? The show is over. And, you know, I really want to thank you for coming in and talking a little bit about the dynamic of how you create legislation, working with everyone to create something for everybody. Right. And I want to thank you for watching today. And this has been The Valley View.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.